Hi, and welcome back. I hope you've all had a good lockdown day. Welcome back to our all new online digital series, JLF, The Brave New World. On behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome to each and every one of you to the Brave New World.
Hello, my name is William Dalrymple. I'm one of the co-directors of the Jaipur Literature Festival, and I'm here to encourage you to turn on for Brave New World. This is the Jaipur in Exile online digital festival. We have an extraordinary array of writers. There are not many positive things coming out of this terrible pandemic, but one positive thing is that all the writers we've ever wanted at Jaipur, who for one reason or another weren't able to make it so far, have all said yes. And we have writers such as Robert Macfarlane, Peter Carey, Alain de Botton, Emmett Duval, writers we have longed to bring to you before, who've been too busy or unable to make the journey, who are now going to make it digitally online to a screen near you. So lock down, log in, and join us, please, for Brave New World.
Dear friends of literature, friends of JLF, we are delighted at the response from all of you to our first digital session some days ago. And we return again today with more programming which looks at the world around us. The brave new world we are trying to understand and to access. Do tune in, do link in, do engage, do comment as we celebrate books, dialogues, and literature.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, William. What better way to start this than with a discussion on the new world disorder, the COVID pandemic, and beyond? At a moment when the world faces unprecedented disruption and crisis, this is a necessary conversation on the new realities that face us. Writer, politician, and public intellectual Shashi Tharoor and President of the Observer Research Foundation, Samir Saran, who have co authored The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative, share their views. For those of you who are in lockdown, wait for Amazon to be able to deliver, and you can order this book online. If I was to take a poll today, I doubt any more than 1 in a billion people would not have heard of Dr. Shashi Tharoor. A third time member of parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, Dr. Tharoor is the best selling author of over 20 fiction and non fiction books. He was a former Under Secretary General of the United Nations and a former Minister of State for Human Resource Development and the External Affairs Ministry in the Government of India. He has won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Sahitya Academy Award for his book, An Era of Darkness. Dr. Tharoor chairs Parliament's Standing Committee on Information Technology. He perhaps is amongst the most hardworking of politicians and yet finds time to write at least 2 to 3 books a year. Welcome, Shashi.
Thank you.
Speaking with him is Samir Saran, who is the president of the Observer Research Foundation, one of Asia's most influential think tanks. He writes frequently on India's foreign policy and issues of global governance, climate change, energy policy, global development, architecture, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and internet governance. Dr. Saran is the author of 4 books, numerous academic papers, and is featured regularly in Indian and international print and broadcast media. He curates the Raisina Dialogue, India's flagship platform on geopolitics and geoeconomics, and chairs CYFY, which is the premier silo in his think tank. Samir, my question to you is, why hasn't the creative industries found space in your think tank? I mean, finally, art matters and impacts all our lives all around us, and more importantly, contributes enormously to our GDP. And I hope you're going to consider this at the end of the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please do post your comments, ask questions by typing it into the comment section. Should you be you have a problem with the bandwidth and you get dropped off, you can follow us on YouTube, on JTR Litfest, or on Instagram or Twitter on our JLF Litfest handles. Over to you both, Shashi Tharoor and Samir Saran.
Thank you, Sanjoy. And I think, as we were speaking just before this event, cultural industries must figure as one of the key discussions at most policy forums. And certainly in the last few years at ORF, we have regularly engaged with artists and with media personalities, film stars, writers, authors, to respond to some of the most crucial questions, such as violent extremism, responding to gender stereotypes, and creating ways to mobilize communities to respond to most important challenges of our time. But cultural industries by themselves need help, need more interrogation, and certainly we should and we will work with you, Sanjoy, to develop a whole program around it. But this one is about the brave new world, and in some ways the new world disorder. And when Shashi and I were authoring this book, which by the way took around 3 years to complete, our idea was to provoke thinking that would put together a new architecture for the future, looking back at the frailties of the past, the frailties of Pax Americana, the bipolar behavior during the Cold War era, and of course, the G0 world post the financial crisis. But let me start with my first question to Shashi, although it's kind of strange talking to you as interrogating you on this particular book. But let me ask you, how does the New World Disorder intersect with the situation we grapple with today? Does it in many ways seek to engage with the vulnerabilities that have been so cruelly put forth for all of us to stare at this particular time?
Absolutely, Samir. And indeed, you already, like some of the West television anchors, know the answer to the question you're trying to ask. But that's a way of starting our conversation. Since you and I wrote the book, The New World Disorder, and we pointed to a number of ailments in the entire situation of global governance facing the world, I'm afraid the COVID disaster has actually brought those very issues to light. In many ways, the thesis of our book has been playing out in real time, and sadly with fatal consequences in weeks. I pick out two themes from the many we addressed in the book that seem relevant to what we've seen about COVID. One is, of course, we talked about the waning legitimacy of international institutions. And you heard the President Trump attacking the World Health Organization in his last couple of days' statements, partially because their response to the outbreak, with its indulgence of the official Chinese line for many, many weeks at the beginning, has now come in for very, very strong criticism. And it's true that many global institutions and their agencies suffer from politicization, from manipulation, from lack of representation, lack of independent leadership and purpose. And sometimes the Chinese are guilty, sometimes the Americans are guilty. Very often the Americans are as much dictating to these organizations, though unlike the Chinese, they're the first ones to slam the door and say we're leaving rather than trying to effect change in a constructive way. But I think it's difficult to completely deny the criticism of the international system and the way it first responded to this crisis. The second issue amongst those that we have already pointed out in our book would, I think, be the extraordinary of nationalism and national sovereignty around the world, because that has combined with this waning legitimacy of international institutions to give us a world that is both less willing to cooperate and also less able to do so because they're all putting up their own barriers. Had the global governance that we talked about been working effectively, the world would have identified the coronavirus as soon as it emerged. The institutions would have sounded a global alarm earlier about its dangers. They would have identified and publicized the best practices that should have been adopted by all countries to prevent its spread. And I must say that that this didn't happen actually points to the very title of our book. This is a disorderly world. It's a state of our new world disorder that's been exposed.
Shashi, let me ask you another question, and I'll be open to responding to some of yours. But let me first ask you one more. Since you spent a long part of your career within the United Nations, and as UN approaches its 75th year this year, Um, some would argue it's time to retire the institution. Others would argue it is time to radically reform the institution. And we've touched on this in our own book. If there were a few things you would do, and if you were made the Secretary General miraculously for, say, the coming years, and say the Americans would support you this time around, what would you do?
Well, look, I mean, it's very easy to sit and prescribe. There are some genuine challenges facing the Secretary General of the United Nations. And he's a good man who's trying to do the best he can. I would argue that at the moment, the real challenge facing the UN is not one of retirement, but indeed one of reform, because it's done well enough over the years to be worth reforming. I agree it's become massively out of date in all sorts of ways. One of the genuine problems the UN is facing is the relative lack of legitimacy from the fact that it still reflects the geopolitical realities of 1945 rather than of 2020. So that a country like India, a country like Brazil, many prominent countries, Germany, Japan, and others, have no voice in the permanent membership of the Security Council and limited voice in the other global bodies, which privileged just a few big powers 75 years ago. That change and that inability to change is weakening the organization, because very clear, if tomorrow the UN levies sanctions on a neighboring country of ours in South Asia, do you think India will feel morally obliged to honor these sanctions if India was not consulted? I think there'll be some real questions about this, and the same with many of the other countries in the world. The same would be true of South Africa. We saw Mandela flying to Tripoli when Libya was under sanctions, and that's what immediately shook up the UN system and said, my God, if a moral leader like Mandela can break sanctions with impunity, the sanctions don't have the legitimacy. We thought, let's quickly settle the problem. So my answer would definitely be, Samir, that we need to improve legitimacy. We need to give it a more predictable funding base. We need to give them more autonomy. And the way you give more autonomy, for example, is to give the head of each organization, whether the Director General of WHO or the Secretary General of the UN, one single non-renewable term of, say, 6 or 7 years, so that they're not beholden to the big powers who could veto their re-election. That's something that's often been held against them, that the WHO Director General has to pay heed to the Chinese and others, otherwise he'll never come back to his job. The same with the Americans. And indeed, it's very true that those...
Let me interrupt you there. I mean, I want to keep to this point here, since we are in a world where this debate is now live and heated. In fact, some of your colleagues have spoken about some class action suits. They have also spoken about taking the WHO chief and the WHO itself to the ICJ and holding them culpable. Now, let me just ask you. We spoke about in our book about the need to give voice to new actors. Why do you assume new actors behave differently? The Chinese, the minute they've got the power, behave no differently to what the Americans did when they were able to manipulate offices. We have, in fact, one deficiency as compared to the Americans. In the Americans, you can petition their Congress, you can lobby for policy change, their democracy is penetrated, their media is available. In China, who do you talk to? If I need information from China, who should I ring up and who should I speak to other than the Communist Party of China?
So the point is that indeed the other countries that come to the same status may also attempt to misuse the status. But the big difference is if you have, say, 10 permanent members of the Security Council rather than 5, you dilute the power of the existing 5. That's why there is resistance. These people realize it. So that even if you have 10 people trying to throw their weight around, correspondingly be throwing around less weight, and that will give more autonomy and independence to the organization. I talked about one single non-renewable term precisely for that reason. I do know of courageous examples of UN leaders who did challenge powerful member states, and without exception, they were not re-elected. Take my friend and one-time rival, Prince Zayed, who was High Commissioner of Human Rights, Zayed Rad al-Hassan. Zayed said things that offended China, said things that offended other states, was outspoken on his defense of the human rights stance taken by his organization. And he was, eventually, it was made very clear to all the permanent members, don't even try for re-election, we're not going to support you. But that was the price he was willing to pay for doing his job with integrity. He only had 5 years. Imagine if every Secretary General of the UN or WHO head could stand up for the integrity of the organization, but be given a decently longer term than the current 5, let's or seven at least, seven would be a good compromise, then I think the world would be in a position to respect the autonomy and integrity of these institutions. This is just a beginning to a longer conversation, but let me turn it to you, Samir, because we also talked in the second half of our book title about the Indian imperative. It was the New World Disorder and the Indian imperative. And you are, as you know, a little more willing to see good things in our present government than I am. But both of us have spoken about India as India, the eternal India that is beyond any one government or any one period of history. How do you feel that India can use these domestic experiences and policy lessons on the global stage? Because we all know that the governance challenges we're facing domestically are a different conversation. That's not in our book. But we've talked about India having offering an imperative to the world. Can you tell me, in your view, how India could exercise global responsibilities different from what we have seen the current big powers in the world exercising when this current pandemic is over?
So, Shashi, let me respond to that in two parts. I think one is on the immediate, because I think that is equally important and in some sense will affect the India story over the longer term. What we do now at this moment is something that is going to be, in some sense, chronicled by many who are watching India's progress. So I think one of our immediate deliverables has to be to make sure that our people tide over this period with minimum loss of life and certainly with minimum loss of livelihood. And I think there is a false debate that we should discard. It's not either about life or about livelihood, it's about both. And I think our policy challenge at this particular moment is to carve a framework that can respond to both these imperatives. We need social protection, we need jobs, we need economic growth, we need tax collections, we need to create redistribution frameworks, and we need to do that even as we live in this age where, as one of your colleagues mentions, the sovereign border is at our doorstep. Our homes are the borders. And in some sense, how do we create this new economic arrangement even as we protect lives? And if we do this well, I think this could be India's single biggest deliverable for itself and for the world, because many others are going to experience similar socio-economic realities such as India's, and of course the weak government capabilities that abound in the global south will find a greater, in some sense, coherence with India's example than with what the Europeans or the Americans were to be able to do. So I think for us to set a global template to respond to a pandemic of this scale is something that we should work very hard on, simply because it is not only for our own people, but it is also for a shining example from the South that others can emulate. And that is something that should be our immediate task. I think we've done some things right here, and which is again something that we have spoken about in the book, that irrespective of the nature of our political leadership, be it the Congress Party or the BJP or someone else, I think the larger collaborative effort that I'm witnessing today, and don't believe the social media, everyone who's on social media, don't believe what you read on the handles. I think the states and the center are largely cooperating. And that spirit of chief ministers working with the prime minister, working with the cabinet ministers, working with their citizens is still visible. You can see shining examples in various parts of the country where this is, of course, doing better than others. But generally, India as a unit is coalescing around the central challenge and is responding. Now, of course, the second part comes from here. This particular challenge also shines a torch on our cruel frailties, on our weak governance, on our rather poor protection of those who need it most. And in some sense, if we can use this challenge, if this moment, to recraft an arrangement that protects the weakest, it will allow us to create a development model. And this is what we have said in our book, that we are not going to be a geo-economic superpower. We are not going to be a geopolitical superpower like the Americans. We are not going to be a manufacturing superpower like the Chinese. Our strength will emerge from us being able to achieve our SDGs, to be able to protect the poor, to be able to create opportunities for those who need jobs. And this particular moment allows us a reset button. I think 2021 onwards will be the India story. If we grab it, it can also be the end of the India story if we do it badly. The Indian imperative today is development, 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 and do it as you save lives. We get this right, we have a template to share with the world. And this is something that we've engaged with in the book, that we might as well be the first $10 trillion economy in the next decade or so, which would do it purely on the basis of its development goals. We would be the first international actor who would be sharing its development agenda with the world, not be setting military bases.